In the 2009 movie Star Trek, Captain Kirk and Sulu plummeted down toward the planet Vulcan without a parachute. Beam us up, Kirk shouted in desperation. Then at the last second, after a tense scene of Chekhov running top speed to the transporter room, the lives were saved moments before they hit the doomed planet's rocky surface. In large, is Trek's transporter a bit like Futurama's suicide booth, but can beaming out save someone's life? Some would argue that having one's molecules scrambled, as Dr. McCoy would put it, is actually the surest way to die. Sure, after you've been taken apart by the transporter, you're put back together somewhere else, good as new. But is it still you on the other side, or is it a copy? If the latter, does that mean the transporter is a suicide box? These issues have received a lot of attention lately given Trek's 50th anniversary last year and the series' impending return to TV. Not to mention, in the real world, scientists have found recent success in quantum teleporting a particle's information farther than before, which isn't the same thing, but still. So while it seems like Trek's transporter conundrum has never had a satisfying resolution, we thought we'd take a renewed crack at it. To be clear, our purpose isn't to get into the nitty-gritty of the science of the transporter. After all, if we could figure out exactly how a transporter works, we could build one. Instead, we'll touch on it only when the science becomes relevant, but, as was the case in our discussion of time travel in Trek, we'll focus mostly on the transporter's effects. And those effects have some interesting consequences. After reviewing the evidence, in fact, there might even be some hope that transport isn't a death sentence and that "beam me up, Scotty" were not Kirk's famous last words. Kirk never said those exact words on the show, of course, but you get the idea. In large, the transporter from Star Trek's original pilot episode, The Cage. Establishing a lock, Trek has always depicted characters who are hesitant to use the transporter, from Dr. McCoy to the entire crew of Enterprise. "You're always on the side of, those guys are just silly, you gotta trust the future," said Jordan Hoffman, a film critic and host of Engage, the official Star Trek podcast. "We trust the warp engines and all the other high-tech of Star Trek, so why wouldn't we trust the transporter?" Hoffman points out the first work to express real doubt about the continuity of personhood was the novel Spock Must Die by James Blish, which played coy about whether it's really you on the other end of the transporter. To address the questions this raised, a good place to start is by looking at what the transporter actually does. According to the Star Trek The Next Generation technical manual, when a person steps onto the transporter pad, the computer uses molecular imaging scanners to scan his or her body, before the person is converted into a subatomically debonded matter stream. In other words, a crew member is taken apart piece by piece, breaking apart the bonds between individual atoms. Then, particles are streamed into a pattern buffer, where they remain briefly before being sent to their destination. This sounds an awful lot like death. In fact, it's even more deathy than conventional death where, after the body's processes have stopped, the body slowly decomposes. The effect is the same, the pieces of you come apart, the transporter's just a lot more efficient at it. Once the matter stream arrives at its destination, the person is somehow rematerialized or put back together. While the transporter tends to use the person's atoms to reconstruct a human, it really doesn't have to. The machine could use totally different atoms, and the effect would be exactly the same. In fact, in the Deep Space Nine episode Our Man Bashir, Captain Sisko and a few other officers are nearly lost during a transporter accident. They beam out from their sabotaged runabout at the last second, but the transporter malfunctions and their patterns must be sent into the station's computer somehow to save them. Their physical bodies are saved as holographic characters in Dr. Bashir's holosuite program. Later in the episode, they're reconstituted using the patterns stored in the holodeck, almost certainly with entirely new atoms. That sounds an awful lot like a copy, or like a new person. If the transporter is just scanning your data and creating an identical copy somewhere else, then by any reasonable definition, the original person is dead. By analogy, consider a car model. Many cars are produced by the same manufacturer, all from the same design. There's no way to tell these cars apart, but they're not the same car. If that's the case and the transporter is really a suicide and copy machine, then Star Trek's bright and optimistic future might not be the rosy place we always thought it was. Of course, there's more to the story than that. For one thing, some might argue this is just semantics. What's the difference between it being you and not you if you've passed through the subatomically debonded transporter? Either way, in large, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy beam down. measure of a man or other life form. This particular technicality opens a philosophical can of gar, which is beyond the scope of this article to fully address and may even be partially subjective and thus fundamentally unresolvable. For one thing, our bodies grow and change over the course of our lives. Cells multiply, die, and are replaced. Even the brain is no exception. There is plenty of change in the brain during development, though birth of new neurons seem to be pretty much restricted to being produced in the dentate gyrus after birth. Patricia Churchland, neurophilosopher with the University of California, San Diego, told us. But there is pruning back, especially in early adolescence, as well as massive sprouting of the neurons you're born with. This makes a person a bit like a paintbrush whose head and whose handle will both be replaced at different times. Is it still the same brush? While the brain is a bit more complex than that, there certainly is quite a bit of overhauling going on across a person's life, according to Churchland. The brain grows about 5 times from birth to adolescence. It makes about 1 million synapses per second in the first 2 years after birth, she said. In early development, a child could lose a whole hemisphere without being changed into a new person. Later in development, lesions can have a greater effect on personality, mobility and cognition, depending on the location of the lesion. But at least in everyday language, we still consider ourselves to be the same person from birth to death. And whether or not that's a valid standard by which to consider oneself the same person, for our purposes, well, use this standard of everyday language. So, the question we're really asking is a transported person still the same person? To the extent that we're the same people throughout our lives, this gives us a clearer criterion on which to assess the question of the transporter. There's another, more famous version of the paintbrush example, a thought experiment known as the ship of Theseus. Theseus wants to keep his ship in tip-top shape, so whenever a board rots, he replaces it with a new one and keeps doing so until none of the original planks remain. Is it still the same ship by our standards? It clearly is. The pieces have been replaced, but there was a continuity in the ship's structure between them. If, however, we destroy the ship but mail its blueprints somewhere else and then build a new, identical ship, it's not the same ship. It's a separate ship built from the same blueprints. It doesn't even matter whether you use the same planks or not. So where does the transporter fit in? Again, page 2. At first glance, it looks an awful lot like it, doesn't? The way that the description of beaming is written, "I would go for you, die and you're reconstructed," said Michael Okuda, technical consultant for the various Trek shows and movies beginning with The Next Generation, on the Engage podcast. I wish we had done some kind of dimensional transfer thing to be less ambiguous. Speaking to us, Okuda elaborated, Star Trek's transporter has generally been thought of as a 3D version of a television. It is said to scan a person atom by atom, convert the atoms to energy, beam the energy to another location, then to convert the energy back to matter in the original pattern. Some have suggested that this is the equivalent of destroying the person at the atomic level, then creating an identical duplicate at a different location. If this is true, then it seems possible that you have killed the original person and created a duplicate who probably doesn't remember dying. By the time Rick Sternbach and I wrote the TNG Tech Manual, the matter-energy conversion process had already been well established in Trek lore, so I felt we needed to respect this notion. If we had written the book much earlier in Trek's history, I think I would have pushed an alternate concept in which the continuity of a person's existence is unambiguous. There it is, right from the horse's mouth. The way it has been written, the transporter is a suicide box. Case closed. A video on the subject by YouTuber CGP Grey presents a thought experiment to show viscerally why this is the case. Imagine that you step onto the transporter, only the part of the device that dematerializes you is broken. The transporter scans you and reconstructs you at the target location, only you haven't been taken apart in the first place. Remember, there's no need for it to take you apart, it can simply scan and reconstruct like a copying machine, leaving the original intact. So the pre-transport you still exists at the same time as post-transport you. Would you then willingly step onto the dematerializer, and be destroyed to make room for your replacement? Once Scotty's fixed it, probably not. There's a problem with this, as Okuda noted. In the Star Trek universe, people are seen using the transporter on a routine basis, which suggests that however this concept is implemented on the Enterprise, it clearly does not involve killing the person. Otherwise, none of those smart people would ever get near the thing, he told us. So there must be a way around the idea of the transporter as a death machine, otherwise, everyone in the Federation would make like Dr. McCoy and avoid this thing like the plague. Nonetheless, it's hard to imagine any escape from such an ironclad conclusion. As we laid out before, our criterion is continuity, and it's hard to maintain an object's continuous structure while taking it apart completely. In Large Forgiveness by David Brin, science fiction author David Brin acknowledged the problem in his sole Star Trek work, a next-generation graphic novel titled Forgiveness. There, he introduces a 21st-century scientist who invents the transporter, Colin Blakeney. Blakeney faces fear and hatred from groups who believe that once a person steps through the transporter, the result is a soulless copy. At one point, the scientist accidentally beams himself into space, where he rematerializes 300 years later aboard the Enterprise. There, he tells Drive Crusher what he has now learned. The transporter doesn't just send information on how to build a copy of you, Blakeney concludes. It sends you, soul and all. Of course it does, Crusher responds. Do you think we could ever step into the thing, if we weren't sure of that whether or not you believe in a soul? In this context, it serves as a placeholder for our continuity requirement. Whatever you is, the transporter sends that, continuity and all. It's not just blueprints to make a copy. How that interpretation works, however, is another story. There are many scientific and philosophical conundrums surrounding the question of identity and whether a duplicate of a person is that person, Brin told us. One trick is to simply posit that future folk have answers for some of the questions that perplex us, just as we now know where, for example, infectious disease comes from. I don't have to explain how it happens, only that our super-advanced descendants firmly believe it to be so. Once again, we're left without a clear idea of how the transporter could escape its grim nature. But like Okuda, Brin seems convinced that somehow, in the Trek universe, the question has been resolved. The trick he employs, of course, is a totally valid one. In science fiction, the author can't possibly figure out exactly how every piece of technology in his world works. If an author did, they'd build it rather than sticking to novels. Molecular imaging thinking about beaming all this doesn't mean there are no answers, or no clues, at least. In the Next Generation episode Realm of Fear, Ensign Reginald Barclay is paralyzed by the thought of the transporter. He expresses a plethora of fears, including being put back together wrong, being mixed with other creatures on the transporter pad, and even transporter psychosis. But tellingly, even Barclay never expresses doubt that helps the same person on the other side. For all his social awkwardness, Barclay is an extremely smart and knowledgeable person. If there was even the slightest doubt, he'd know about it, and likely be terrified of it. As any die-hard Trekkie might tell you, the show's our official canon. Anytime there's a universal conflict, the show's version of events would supersede those of the comic. This has occasionally happened over Trek's 50 years, as the TV writers don't always pay much attention to the novels and comics though they have, and the comic and novel writers can't know what will be written in a future episode. Luckily for Brin's Forgiveness, that's not what happened here. According to the book, Blakeney was forgotten by history, and his invention never caught on. Instead, the transporter was invented later by Erickson, who received the credit. The two stories are compatible. Judging by this short, promoting Star Trek Into Darkness, Barclay is not the only one in the Trek universe with transporter fears, nor is he the only one apparently unconcerned about not being the same person on the other side. However, this was not always the case in the Trek universe. As mentioned before, there were protests within the universe at the first invention of the transporter. The Enterprise episode Daedalus reinforces this idea, revealing that the transporter's acknowledged creator, Erickson, had to fight against such thoughts. There was all that metaphysical chatter about whether or not the person who arrived after the transport was the same person who left and not some weird copy, says Erickson. Which would make all of us copies, responds Trip Tucker, Enterprise engineer. I had to fight all of that nonsense, replies Erickson. The exchange is a clear indication that even in this era, a crew that hasn't gotten over their fears of the transporter still has no doubts about the continuity of their personhood, and furthermore, their certainty comes from decades of discussion, debate, and science. Thinking while beaming, by far the most significant clue the episode Realm of Fear provides is the rare glimpse into the experience of transporting. We see, through Barclay's eyes, his field of view washed over by the transporter effect until he seems to be fully inside the beam. There, he sees a worm-like creature swimming towards him, which is later revealed to be a quasi-energy microbe that exists within the transporter beam. How is this possible? How can Barclay see anything in the transporter beam, much less a microbe? If the description of the transporter we've been going by is correct, it takes you apart, converts you to energy, and then reconstructs you at the other end. There's no way you'd be conscious during the process, much less able to see. That is, unless there's some kind of dimensional transfer thing going on, as Okuda put it, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Maybe Barclay saw the microbe as he was rematerializing, so there was enough of his brain intact to perceive the microbe. But that doesn't match what the officers say about the incident. Data, for instance, tells Barclay, normal spatial relationships are often distorted within the matter stream. Your perceptions may have been exaggerated. The keywords there are within the matter stream. According to the aforementioned technical manual, the matter stream is a subatomically debonded state, and you can't do much perceiving if your molecules are not attached to each other. Earlier in the episode, Barclay also confirms, when talking with Chief O'Brien, that a fluctuation occurred while I was inside the matter stream. That fluctuation, we later find out, is caused by the microbes that Barclay saw, strongly implying it happened while he was completely in the form of a matter stream. Maybe that episode was a fluke. Maybe it was written in a misleading way, or maybe I'm misinterpreting it. But tellingly, that's far from the only example in Trek. Page 3, Deep Space Nine's transporter. In the Next Generation's first season, we find another clue. In the episode Lonely Among Us, an energy being merges with Picard's consciousness, then uses the transporter to beam, with Picard's body, back into its native nebula as pure energy without rematerializing. And this scheme works. Both the entity's consciousness and Picard's are able to exist in the nebula without being reconstituted as a physical body. That by itself is weird. We don't know how beings of pure energy work, and according to our discussion with an astrophysicist, they probably would NT, but Picard at least should NT be able to have any sort of thought or experience without a brain. At least, he should NT be able to, unless the transporter's somehow built to maintain some sort of continuous neural activity while going throughout transport. That would explain Barclay's ability to see microbes while inside the matter stream. It also matches up nicely with Okuda's dimensional transfer thing sentiment. There's another oddity in that Lonely Among Us episode. In order to save Picard, the crew allows his consciousness to return to the ship, traveling through its computer systems. Ultimately, they're able to use the transporter to materialize a new version of Picard. But this new version is created from the computer's stored pattern of Picard, which was stored as had just beamed out. Enlarged Picard, in the form of energy much like the energy creature seen here, traveled through the Enterprise's systems and into the transporter's relays, merging with his physical pattern. At first this sounds like the transporter can be used to simply copy a person, and the copy is totally separate from the original. But we're missing one important detail. The episode portrays the situation such that this is an unusual circumstance. The only reason the crew can create a viable copy is because they merged their physical copy with Picard's consciousness, which was roaming the ship as an energy being. Before they knew his consciousness was roaming the ship as energy, no one thought to bring Picard back using the store transporter pattern alone. This implies that, for some reason, Trek requires an ongoing process of mental activity during the transporter beam. Without it, we're told, the crew would NT be able to bring Picard back. In our man Bishop, Sisko, O'Brien, Kira, and Dax, divorced from their minds, are stored in the holosuite, where they adopt the personalities of holosuite characters. Here, they're beamed off the holosuite to be reunited with their minds. Then, there's that aforementioned Deep Space Nine episode, Our Man Bashir. Again, this episode treats the transporter process as if the mental processes are somehow handled separately by the machine. As the crew is about to lose the rapidly degrading transporter signals of Sisko and the others, Odo declares, we're going to have to preserve the neural signatures of everyone on that runabout. Ultimately, they do this by transferring the minds of their crewmates into the station's computer, erasing their entire database to do so. The physical patterns, meanwhile, are separately sent into Bashir's holosuite program, divorced from their personalities and memories. There's no reason for this to be the case under the conventional model of the transporter. Neural signals, or rather the activity of your brain, is composed of exchanges of ions, which are usually atoms missing one or more electrons. These are physical particles that would be converted to energy just like everything else. The same goes for the chemicals and cells in your brain. There should be no difference between the brain and the rest of the body. They shouldn't be treated separately. But if the people of the 24th century care about the continuity of their existence, they would have likely figured out a way to continue the process of brain activity even if the rest of the body is constructed anew at the destination. All this means Trek crews would have had to send the brain a different way. The trouble is, that sounds a bit like asking too much. How can mental activity be sent, active, in a transporter beam without violating the laws of physics? Quantum resolution. Christopher L. Bennett, a Star Trek novelist who always puts a lot of thought into the science and philosophy behind his stories, grappled with this very issue in a blog post. I'm not stepping in one of those things, or having one of my beloved characters step into one, at any rate, unless I can be persuaded that there's a continuity of self-awareness from one end to the other, he wrote. Bennett concludes that quantum teleportation, a real phenomenon, offers a conclusive, scientific answer to the problem. Quantum teleportation is a process by which information about a particle's quantum state is traded with another particle at the receiving end, essentially transforming that particle into the original particle. Crucial to this process is quantum entanglement, a process in which two particles that interact can become correlated with each other. Particles in a human body or any macroscopic object are becoming entangled all the time, since they're interacting all the time. Bennett argues that it's this constant entanglement that allows a human brain to be a continuous whole in the first place. In other words, saying there's a continuity of your brain's structure simply means that its particles are correlated with each other via quantum entanglement, according to Bennett. As I see it, since quantum identity is defined by state information rather than physical substance, the self endures in the transporter pattern, the energy matrix encoding the quantum-level information of the transported subject's structure, while the physical particles of the body are dissociated, i.e. have their state information temporarily removed from them and stored in the beam instead, Bennett told us. So when characters in Trek talk about the transporter converting matter to energy, my rationalization is that they don't literally mean mass-energy conversion by EMC2, which would entail a horrifyingly destructive energy release, but rather they are talking about your identity, your physical pattern and consciousness, being temporarily encoded in the beam's energy matrix, the transporter pattern, until they can be reunited with your particle stream. We won't get too deep into the quantum mechanical detail here, though you should check out the blog post for more. For our purposes, the important point is that this allows for the continuity we're looking for. The person who materializes on the planet is the person who stepped onto the pad. This idea neatly dovetails with the evidence we've seen in the show. If the transporter is separating your particles from their state information and sending the state information as part of an energy beam along with the particles themselves, this could explain why Picard's energy was needed to recombine with his physical pattern in Lonely Among Us. It can also explain why Barclay could remain conscious during transport in Realm of Fear. A person exists throughout transport, but they're just temporarily not connected to the atoms that make them up. The problem with such a heady rationale, of course, is setting up a scenario where this could actually work, even in a Star Trek setting. Is anything like this possible? Alas no, said Lawrence Krauss, a physicist at Arizona State University. Krauss is the director of the Origins Project there and author of The Physics of Star Trek. He did not mince words. Humans are not in a carefully prepared quantum state, so can't entangle. One might imagine that's a simple limit of present-day technology that our Star Trekky descendants might one day overcome, but Krauss didn't see it that way. Anything that you could get into such a carefully prepared state, I think that would not be a human, Krauss said. It would resemble a human like an atom resembles a human. That's certainly a hitch in the plan, but it's no surprise to Krauss. In The Physics of Star Trek, he examines the plausibility of each of the major Trek technologies, and his section on the transporter deems it as easily the least plausible in the entire book. Even warp drive, itself highly far-fetched, isn't ruled out as thoroughly as the transporter. Krauss doesn't get into quantum teleportation in the book, instead discussing the more conventional idea of taking people apart atom by atom and sending them that way. Nonetheless, his writing illustrates everything wrong with trying to teleport a macroscopic object like a person. The task of taking apart and reassembling a person at the submolecular level is so complex, energy-consuming, and dependent on massive computational power as to be prohibitive, even if it was possible in principle. Enlarge the transporter in the current movie series. Heisenberg compensators. Nonetheless, Bennett was not deterred. One of the fundamental difficulties in trying to carefully take apart and reassemble a collection of atoms is a rule in quantum mechanics known as Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The trouble is that it's fundamentally impossible to know both the particle's position and where it's moving its momentum at the same time. A transporter computer would have to know both to faithfully reconstruct the person. The Trek writers were well aware of this problem, so they introduced a component of the transporter known as the Heisenberg compensator. It's never precisely spelled out what this component does, but presumably, whatever it is, it finds a way around this very problem. I tend to assume that the Heisenberg compensator is based on the same entanglement principle used in quantum teleportation to get around the uncertainty principle, entangling both the subject and the receiving station with the same reference object, Bennett told us. So I see that as a way of maintaining the correlation that preserves continuity of consciousness. Speaking to us, he happily elaborated, it's pretty clear that there is continuity of consciousness in Trek transporters, not just before and after but during beaming. And I do think this can be explained in quantum information terms. We can assume that dematerialization works like in quantum teleportation theory. The state information of all the particles is scanned in a way that destroys the original, since quantum information can't be duplicated, so you have to remove it from the original in order to store it elsewhere, and the information is transmitted by a mix of quantum entanglement and classical data transmission, in this case via subspace onto another matter supply that becomes the new physical host for that information, effectively becoming the original entity. But since transporters are able to send the actual particle stream through subspace to the destination, you don't need the second matter supply and can just transfer the information both ways, from the particles into the beam matrix and then back again. Since the person's consciousness and identity have a continuous, unbroken quantum existence throughout the process, due to being stored in the beam, there is no loss of continuity and it's the same person throughout. Bennett also addressed how this applies to the ship of Theseus. Now, this avoids the whole ship of Theseus question, since you actually are using the original particles. Although, in quantum terms, that doesn't make a difference. One particle is interchangeable with any other, and only its current quantum state matters. I presume that the reason transporters use the original matter stream instead of a separate matter source is because it's more versatile, allowing you to beam someone anywhere instead of just to a pre-existing, compatible receiving station. But the Theseus idea could apply to something like the enemy within. Where did the matter supply for the duplicate Kirk come from? Maybe the transporter beamed up some air and rock from the area and imposed Kirk's transporter pattern onto its particles, a glitchy form thereof with some gaps in the neurology, one assumes. Assuming Bennett's idea works, it doesn't distinguish between the brain state and any other information about you. All that stuff is in the quantum state. So we should see more going on during the transporter beams in Star Trek than merely a continuation of mental activity. The fact is, we'd see more. The Voyager episode Tuvix provides an interesting case of hijinks going on within the matter stream. Two crew members, Tuvix and Neelix, are merged into one person, Tuvix, in a transporter accident due to an alien flower they carried with them. The flower has evolved to bond with microbial life at a cellular level, so within the matter stream, it was able to latch onto their DNA strands, since their cells were in a state of flux. But this implies their cells still existed in some form within the matter stream. There's also the film Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Lieutenant Saavik, beamed up mid-sentence from the Genesis planet, is able to continue talking while beaming up, well before her form takes shape on the transporter pad. Her voice is distorted, but it's clear they were talking within the beam. And of course, the TNG episode Realm of Fear yet again provides an example. The microbes that attach themselves to Barclay are moving around within the transporter beam. Barclay sees them and raises his hand as if to shield himself. His hand is still in a raised position when he materializes on the transporter pad. Some form of this explanation may well be what's going on in the Trek universe, but it's far from perfect. Even Bennett himself acknowledges that. The whole matter stream idea is the result of Rick Sternbach and Okuda's attempt to come up with a more physically plausible alternative to the original matter-into-energy premise, so it's necessarily a bit clumsy. Enlarge the cast of Star Trek Discovery on their transporter pads. Energize. We set out to determine whether the transporter, as depicted in Star Trek, kills the person who steps into it. And in one respect we've succeeded. We've found a scheme that fulfills the requirements we set out for ourselves in the beginning. It's a bit of a stretch from the standpoint of real physics, according to Lawrence Krauss, but then so is the transporter in general. The point of the article was not to find a physical mechanism for the transporter that would work. Nonetheless, it feels like something's missing. And maybe that's fitting. Trying to get a transporter to both take a person apart and reassemble them while keeping them somehow alive during the process is a lot like trying to have your cake and eat it too. And yet, as we've shown, that's the way transporters have always been written in Star Trek. In example after example, characters in Trek are aware of something happening within the matter stream, and the transporter pad is shown incapable of recreating a person from records like a replicator can with food. They're consistently shown as requiring the person's neural patterns to be both treated separately from the matter stream and somehow existing continuously during transport. So there's evidence in the show's canon that something unique is going on, whether it's Okuda's dimensional transfer thing or Bennett's quantum teleportation or something else entirely. The question is, what is that guiding principle? We've poked around at the best possible answers in Trek lore. Often in science, studies have to leave it to future works by other scientists to suss out the deeper details and implications of their work that they couldn't cover within the scope of that study. Maybe with more time, and better instruments, we'll learn more. That's precisely the case here. Maybe the upcoming Star Trek Discovery or the continuing movie series will provide more clues to which theory is truly dictating the universe. But until then, we've at least established that the way the transporter is treated in the show does meet the Ship of Theseus standard. There's a continuous mental process throughout the beam, somehow, even if it doesn't sound possible from the technical manual's description of how the device works. That's certainly something, but the rest will have to be a work in progress. This post originated on Ars Technica.